Hello and welcome to Autistic FM. My name is Haya. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm your crossing guard to remind you to slow down around schools. You can subscribe to Autistic FM wherever you get your podcasts, and it would be awesome if you did. That's how we grow and that's how we thrive. On our website at autistic.fm, you can find episode transcripts and additional information. We also have discussion threads for each individual episode, a neurospicy discussion forum, and much, much more. And all of that is free. If you become a supporter for as little as $5 a month, you can get a sneak preview of the topics we have coming up, and even submit questions for our guests. You can also add topics to our future topics wish list, and you'll get access to a supporters-only discussion group. We have a bunch of additional supporter treats coming up, so stay tuned. In this episode of the podcast, I am joined by Catherine Brunton, a passionate advocate for neurodivergence who is candid about her experience with addiction and the process of discovering her autism. Growing up in a family with autistic members, Catherine was unaware of her own neurodivergence until a late diagnosis in her late 30s. Her journey towards self-realization was a transformative process amplified by her path to sobriety during the tumultuous COVID-19 pandemic. During this conversation, Catherine and I explore themes of addiction and substance dependence, the impact of late autism diagnoses, and the struggles with masking and self-identity. Catherine shares her personal journey, detailing the relief and challenges that comes with embracing a neurodivergent and LGBTQ identity. We also dive into her spiritual practices and how surrounding herself with supportive communities aids her in maintaining peace and acceptance. I do need to add a quick trigger warning for this one. This episode contains discussions of addiction and substance abuse, experiences of trauma and suicidal ideations, as well as references to sexual assault. None of the descriptions in this podcast are particularly graphic, but please do take care of yourself and listen as feels right to you. And with all of that out of the way, let's roll tape. All right, my dear guest, thank you for joining me on the podcast today. I'd love to start with your name and your pronouns, please.
I'm Catherine or Kathy, and my pronouns are she, her.
Wonderful to meet you, or meet you like this. Where
Yeah.
in the world are you?
I'm in Toronto, in Canada. So,
Okay, you
Ontario.
don't sound
Yeah.
Torontesian.
No. So I've lived here for about a year and a half.
Okay.
I grew up in England.
I am curious, how did you discover that you were neurodivergent?
So the irony of the story for me is that I grew up in a family with a brother who's a couple of years younger, and then another brother who's 7 years younger. And my middle brother, he was diagnosed with autism when he was about 7 or 8, and so I would have been 9, 10 years old. And I had quite an interest in autistic spectrum from a young age, having a brother who was diagnosed. We realized that my dad probably was. He never got a formal diagnosis, but he would say he's autistic. Um, and I decided to study child studies at university level and did my dissertation all about autistic spectrum pupils included in mainstream education. Um, and I knew that there was a higher chance that I might have children who are autistic because it's genetically in our family. So when my children were born, I was on the lookout and I got my eldest, she's diagnosed autistic when she was 4 years old. And I still had no idea that I might be autistic because I was highly masking. And I actually was 38, I think, 39, when I started to think I might be autistic. And the reason I started to see the signs was actually because I got clean and sober. So I'd been drinking a lot and then got into other recreational drugs. And I hit a kind of rock bottom in 2020 when it was COVID as well, which is a really interesting time to get clean and sober. And
Yeah.
once I stopped using those substances, that was a big part of my masking strategy, right? And then I was still masking because that's like all I knew, but I started to see the reasons why I used drugs and alcohol, really. And I started
Mhm.
to realize how socially awkward I was. Um, and I also, so at the same time as having that all going on of like, oh, now I'm not using these substances, I can sort of see a bit more my authentic personality. we were also in this like weird bubble thing where it's like you have to stay at home and be on your own. And I suddenly realized like I'm so much more comfortable being in my pajamas all the time. And I
Right.
knew I had some sensory issues. I'd always thought like maybe I have some sensory issues because like some people in my family are autistic and it's sort of like a little bit of it bled over or something. And then I was like, no, like I have major sensory issues. And actually being on my own, I was like, I enjoy this way more than I thought I would.
Mm.
So yeah, it made me start to kind of question my neurodiversity, and I also like realized that some of the drugs that I used were kind of self-medicating potentially for ADHD, and I met other
Hmm.
people who were addicts in recovery who had also got diagnosed ADHD since they'd been got clean, and so the whole thing started to kind of percolate. But I really knew a lot about autism, and I was like, how can I have missed this? But then I started reading more about women with autism, and I went
Right.
to see my like GP family doctor, and I was like, hey, I think I might have autism. And I was in England still. And the wait is about 2 years at that
Hmm.
time, maybe three. But someone told me about something called the right to choose, where you could go to a private doctor, but the NHS would still pay for it. So I was
Hmm.
really grateful to that person, and I got a diagnosis within 6 months, actually. But the person who diagnosed me, the psychiatrist who diagnosed me, he was like, I think you should probably get an ADHD assessment and maybe even OCD. And I was like, oh, great, okay.
Right.
So yeah, I was well into my late 30s, before I even realized. And but once I kind of looked into it more and like assessed it for myself, it was quite quick to accept it, actually, because I was like, well, this kind of makes sense. Like, I come
Right.
from a family of other people who are autistic. Um, and it sort of really helped me, I think, understand a lot of things looking back. But then there was
Yeah.
also this grieving process too. And I think I mean, in some ways, it's only been like 4 years. There's sometimes still in that grieving process because grief isn't like a, linear one-time thing, is it?
Yeah.
But there was certainly a big kind of emotional like relief at first to be like, okay, there's all these reasons why I'm different and it's okay. And I'm not broken and just like a really useless human being. But then there was also this kind of grief of like, but hang on, if I'd known this sooner, maybe I wouldn't have gone down so many paths that were, dangerous and, made me vulnerable.
Hmm.
And maybe my self-esteem would be a bit higher if I had thought this earlier, that it's okay, I'm just different. I'm not broken in a way.
How long ago did you get your diagnosis?
So I think the autism diagnosis was about 3 years ago.
Okay.
I'm
Yeah.
trying to work it back because, and then I got the ADHD diagnosis a year ago when I got here into
Right.
Canada. So yeah, yeah. So it's only been 3 years that I've been, so 4 years I would say I've been self-identifying as autistic, and
Right.
3 years officially diagnosed. Well, I kind of dilemmaed about whether to even get an official diagnosis because I was like, well, I have read up enough about this, and like I'm kind of, as I say, the irony of being almost an expert in spotting it in other people, but not in myself. But then I realized that I wanted to have that kind of not justification is not the right word, but that affirmation that it was okay,
Yeah.
that this isn't just in my head, and that imposter syndrome that you kind of get of like, oh, am I just like looking for something to be wrong with me? Um, And I also decided that it might be helpful in the workplace because I've struggled my whole life, and still do with, negotiating the workplace. And so I thought having it actually on a piece of paper where you can say, hey, I'm actually
Right.
disabled officially, you have to like try and accommodate me, might be helpful. So I thought, yeah, let's do this.
Yeah. No, I think that's super smart. I think that's super smart. Um, it's a really interesting thing that you mentioned, kind of the pandemic and being kind of isolating as a kind of an amplifier in a way for your sobriety journey. I feel like
Mm.
the pandemic sent people one way or the other. It was a pretty intense time.
Yeah, and I've heard quite a few stories either way, especially when it comes to like addiction, because I've heard
Hmm.
people who were actually doing quite well with sobriety and staying clean, and then went off the rails in the kind of isolation of COVID. Whereas my story was things were getting steadily worse. Like I had been drinking regularly since I was 18, 19 years old. Um, and then looking back, I never really drank in a sort of social, typical way, I guess. It appeared like I did to other people. Um,
Right.
but I was always drinking either to get drunk because I just didn't want to feel, or I was drinking to try and amplify, like be funny, be sociable. Like I just didn't know how to be. So I was
Right.
like, had this persona that the alcohol helped me have. And then when I started, like, it was only for about 4 years that other like recreational drugs got involved. Um, because alcohol had just been the drug I'd been using and it's easy to get and it's socially acceptable. And so,
Right.
but there was other people that came into my life that introduced other drugs and I was like, yeah. And that's when I then, finally realized I was an addict. I got to that point of like, I was like, oh, I'll just do anything that anyone offers me if it
Right.
makes me feel good or gets me away from feeling bad, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, but
Was it
yeah,
was
so
it that
I
obvious to you? Was it like, hey, I will do something because I want to feel good or I want to feel less bad? Or was it more of a not nearly as well eloquent, just this kind of like could you
no,
describe
not
that for me? Because I'm
yeah, it's
curious.
interesting. Not at the time, like, and it's really hard. Like now I'm where I am, and I've realized all these things. It's hard to put yourself back to that
Right.
time when you didn't know, and it's like, no, I didn't think I was um drinking to avoid my feelings.
Yeah.
I thought I was just drinking because that's what you do. It started as I wanted to be social and fun at university
Right.
and just fit in. And then I realized like this is great. Um, and then it just became a habit. And I had several moments, in those, I mean, it must be what, 20 from 18, yeah, from 18 to 38. So for 20 years I was drinking. And then for 4 years doing other drugs. And I had moments where I thought, I'm not sure if like my relationship with alcohol is that healthy. But then I'd be like, oh, but I can go like a couple of evenings without drinking. So it's
Right.
okay. And I had this idea in my head that an addict is someone who has to drink every day, and has to have a drink in the morning to get out of bed to go to work. Um, and I now know that's alcohol dependent, and that is one form of alcoholism or addiction where you literally, have to have drink or whatever your drug of choice is every day, or you're in withdrawal. But for me, I was never that kind of addict. I could go a few days without doing drugs, but I was always thinking about the next time I was going to be drinking or doing drugs.
Right.
But no, at the time, most of the time I was using, I wasn't really conscious about it, especially not drinking. I just thought it was just what I did. It was just habit. Um, Once I started using other like class A substances, there were moments where I recognized like I had that feeling like I just didn't want to be in my own skin,
Mm.
or I wanted to peel my skin off, or I was so like heightened. And so I was like, right, I'm going to do drugs. This will fix this. And so then I had this connection of like, sometimes there was this either this too much energy and I felt really hyper and I wanted to bring myself, ground myself, or the moments where I was like, everything's awful. I just want to die, or I don't want to be here, or I don't want to think or feel. And then I would reach for that. But there was a lot of other times in between that where it was just like I thought I was just partying or having fun,
Right.
and a lot of the time it was social for me as well, which is what I think helped me stay in denial for a lot longer about it. Because
Right.
I was like, but again, looking back, I then realized there'd be parties where I'd be doing drugs and trying to share them around. And actually, most of my friends were having one or two beers and they're like, no, I'm all right. And I was the
Right.
one kind of pushing it. And I was the one who couldn't stop, at the end of the
Yeah.
night. Um, and it was like, yeah, but it's very hard to try and remember how that felt back then. Now that I'm like out of it and I've sort of done all this like therapy and analysis and looked at it from a different perspective and understand why. And I was like, but at the time I had no idea, really.
Yeah.
I was just sort of sleepwalking through life and I was hurting a lot and it was protecting me. But then because I was using um, substances so much to kind of sleepwalk through life, and because I'm autistic, I was so vulnerable. So then I ended up in worse and worse situations, which then
Right.
led to me, the cycle just carried on because then it led to me using more and drinking more to deal with the situations I was in.
Yeah.
Because I ended up, in steadily worse series of relationships that got more and more abusive as time went on. And I would like end one and think, oh, that wasn't great. And then end up right back in another abusive relationship. And again, at the time, I couldn't see that at all until the last one. So the relationship I was in just before I got clean, I did start to have an inkling that that might be not good. I wouldn't
Yeah.
have still called it an abusive relationship yet while I was still in it, but
Right.
I did. I was starting to see that there's some problem here with the people I'm choosing to be in
Yeah.
relationships with. And it was the decision to get clean that made me end that relationship because that person was using too. So I thought if I really want to get clean and sober, I need to end this relationship because otherwise, if someone else is doing it in the
Yeah. You
house,
just
you're
get dragged
gonna,
back in, kind of thing. Yeah.
yeah. So that was actually my thought process of ending that, and kicking him out. And then it was like later, a few weeks or months later, that everything, well, people said to me like, you need to get help in this situation, you need to get the police involved, like this isn't right. And
Hmm.
then once the police were involved, they were like, would you like some help from the like, domestic abuse? And I was like, really? Okay, I guess. And then I was like, oh yeah, this was, and it was like, I just I think that again, the massive empathy that we have as autistic people, but not always being able to connect the dots of what you're feeling
Right.
makes us very vulnerable to narcissists and controlling people because they, prey on that. And I would always assume the best of people and assume that they want to grow and change as well. Um, but yeah, I think that kind of, yeah, that's the story of most of my sort of not very good relationships in the past is like me having this massive empathy, wanting to fix other people, thinking I can change
Right.
and fix other people, and not realizing that they're just preying on my kind of empathy and goodwill, and they have no interest in growing or changing.
Yeah.
But it was definitely as I say, I see how they all kind of link together. So the neurodiversity and the addiction then led me to that place of being very vulnerable to abusive relationships. It's sort of like this perfect storm, really.
Yeah. No, I hear that. I want to briefly double click on something you said earlier about alcohol dependence versus different alcoholic type situations. Because I suspect so
Mm,
many people listening to this, that will be new to them. I was sitting in a pub once somewhere in London, and I was sitting with kind of a newish friend, and he was like, "I'm an alcoholic," and I'm like, I just bought you a pint. What's going on?" He was like, "Yeah, well, there's two types of alcoholics. There's people who can't um, who can't not drink, and there's people who can't stop drinking. I'm a can't stop drinking alcoholic, and I've decided to drink today. And I was like, okay, that sounds dangerous. But the
Mm.
distinction, and there's a whole bunch of stories related to that, but the distinction to me of like, oh, there's people who can't get out of bed without having a shot of vodka, but there's also people who are fine not drinking for stretches at a time, but if they start drinking, they will drink everything in the house, kind of thing.
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, I think your friend's kind of phrasing of it is very interesting. Um, because, but yeah, I would say um, that it doesn't really matter in some
Right.
ways because it's about the so for me, addiction is about obsession and compulsion to do
Mm-hmm.
something. And so,
Yeah.
that for me manifests in drugs and alcohol, but for other people, it might be shopping or sex or porn or whatever, there's all gambling. So it's that obsession and compulsion that you can't let go of and you feel that you need and you're obsessing. So, um, and then the kind of, the distinction of I have to drink every day or I can go between and not drink, but then once I start drinking, I won't stop. Is really just a physical distinction about
Yeah.
whether the amount, and that's kind of specific to alcohol, I think. I mean, I'm not enough of an expert in other drugs to know. Um, but yeah, there's something that happens with alcohol when you have a certain amount, and you go over a tipping point, then you get dependent, then your body needs it every day, and the withdrawal can kill you if you
Mm-hmm.
come off it too quickly. So if you are alcohol dependent, you need to go to detox and be supervised by medical professionals. Whereas
Yeah.
I was never alcohol dependent, and I knew that because I could go a few days without drinking.
Right.
So I was able to detox without being in a medical facility. But
Yeah.
I found it interesting that what I was using to justify to myself that I wasn't an addict, I didn't have a problem, um, was actually like this false kind of hope I was giving myself because, as I say, when I looked back, I was like, oh, but those days when you weren't drinking, you were sitting there patting yourself on the back going, well done, you didn't have a drink today, Kathy. And it's like other people don't have to do that. They don't have to tell themselves, well done, you didn't have a
Right.
drink today. Like they just
Right.
don't have a drink today. And then they think, oh, it's Friday, maybe I'll have a bottle of wine. And that's the kind of like people who have a healthy relationship with that alcohol and aren't addicts can do that. And it's
Yeah.
like I had to, and I noticed the interesting thing I noticed again looking back, and I didn't see this at the time as a problem at all. So when I got pregnant both times, I stopped drinking because my obsession switched. I was so focused
Mm,
on having babies, and that was one of the things for me that was really important. Like I really want to be a mother, I really want to have babies. So my obsession switched to the baby. So that's why it was very easy for me to not drink, and I wasn't alcohol dependent. Um,
right.
but as soon as they were born, um, I started drinking again as a reward. So it was
Right.
like, I mean, I don't know, maybe 6 weeks old or something. They were not like immediately, but it was like, if I can get the baby into bed, especially once I had two and the toddler's not screaming, then I get a glass of wine or whatever it is. And it was like this kind of, I had to justify it and I had to reward myself with it, as opposed to it just being like a treat. Like I can have a bar of
Right.
chocolate or I can have a glass of wine. Like if it's just a substance that you consume, that's just something.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, it was like I had to, and I also, like actually with my first child, I remember my granddad died when my daughter was like 6, 7 months old or something. So I was still breastfeeding. We had the funeral on Christmas Eve. My granddad died. And
Oof.
so I was so distraught, and the family was, obviously, it was a difficult time. but I couldn't conceive of any other way to deal with this than alcohol. So I was like the one who was like, right, we're all going to the pub after the funeral to drag everyone there. And then I was like timing my drinks so that I would, breastfeed, then have a drink afterwards, then wait enough time so I could feed the baby again and then have another drink. And again, that kind of behavior of like planning your drinks around, that kind of thing. It was just like so obsessive, but it was like, okay, how can I make the baby fit into what I need to do? Is the alcohol was still coming first, and it was
Yeah.
like very topsy-turvy, that kind of yeah.
Yeah, I
But
hear that.
yeah,
Could you tie this to autism for me? Where do you think the overlap is?
so
What do you think made it trickier, harder? What was masking what? That kind of thing.
I think the reason I first started drinking was similar to everything with autism, of like I'm trying to figure out how to be a person here.
Hmm.
And I'm trying to watch all of you, and it doesn't come naturally. So I'm just going to try and do what you do. And then it was also, though, this massive social anxiety of like every time, I look back at my childhood in school, when I wasn't drinking, and just feeling so out of place,
Hmm.
so awkward. And it was like as soon as I started drinking, I just didn't care. It's not that I didn't feel awkward anymore, because I did still at times. But it was like I could just not care that I was awkward. And I was also, I was quite loud and this big personality as a kid at times. And then I was also quite timid. And then once I realized I could drink to just be loud, but then I could also laugh it off
Hmm.
with it. So it was like if you have a night socializing and then you do something really embarrassing, I would then, I was like, oh, this is convenient because I can be like, oh,
Right.
it's not because
Like, ha ha
I'm
ha, I was
awkward or
drunk
I,
kind of
yeah,
thing, rather than
yeah,
I have terrible
yeah,
impulse control and I don't know what the hell I'm doing kind of thing.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And that is really how, and then it also, like, for a while it was helping with sleep. I mean, actually I've messed up my sleep a lot because of drinking and then there were drugs and stuff, and but that's another thing that a lot of us struggle with who are neurodiverse, and it
Right.
was like I could just sort of sedate myself to sleep. um and so there was, yeah, there was many. And then it was interesting because one of the other drugs that I really gravitated to was cocaine, which is a stimulant, and it's very similar to what the drugs that they prescribe for
Hmm.
ADHD. And I used to have this sort of real sense of like clarity and calm, and I didn't realize, I sort of didn't notice that it was affecting the other people that I was doing drugs with differently.
Right.
But I actually realized, and again, it was something that I put together once I got clean. But I was like, oh, that's why I gravitated to that drug, because it actually made me feel normal for a bit. And
Right.
the biggest thing was, it's like all the other voices went quiet in my head, or I could just focus on one voice rather
Yeah.
than, I think they were still there, but that was the effect that it had on me. So that was like just a little bit of peace and quiet from my own mind. And I think alcohol did that in a different way because it just numbed everything down. And so I think, and then the other interesting thing with linking the addiction to the autism was, I think I was quite stubborn as well. Like I say, I think to know for quite a long time to accept that it was a problem. It took me a long time because I just had to kind of process it. Like it was this idea of making a massive change was too overwhelming. But then once I did, as soon as I decided, right, I'm an addict, this is the problem, and I need to get sober and clean, then it was actually quite quick to do something about it. Because it was that, and that's how I feel like often we are when we're autistic. We can take quite a while about a decision, or we can take a while to see something because we're
Right.
just sort of oblivious to some things, really. And I was just so, I mean, me personally, I was just so out of touch with myself because I'd never learned that the some of the reasons I was out of touch with myself was because I was autistic, and
Right.
there's ways around it. But I had this like bundle of emotions and big feelings, but I couldn't connect to them. I didn't know what I was feeling when, and so I was just used to being disconnected. And so it took a long time for me to like join the dots and be like, yeah, this is the problem, and me drinking is just making me more disconnected. It's not solving the
Right.
problem. But then once I was like, okay, actually, I accept this is the problem. I'm an addict. Okay, I need to do something about it. I need to stop using. I need to get help. And I did. And I then was like, it wasn't easy at all. I had a lot of help and I still
Yeah.
do. I am still part of the recovery community, and I talk to people on a daily, weekly basis who are addicts in recovery, and that's how I stay clean. But it's
Hmm.
like, it was very easy to make that decision to commit to, right now, this is, I'm going to change my life. I'm going to change my life by not using substances anymore and figure out what's going on. And as I say, it was the other way around. Like I made that decision and then I realized I'm autistic.
Right.
Um, but it was
And
just,
that you had to adjust a bunch of other stuff. You mentioned turfing a partner
yeah,
out. You mentioned coming to other realizations. So it feels like it was like, oh, I have now
yeah,
decided that this is my direction, and what do I need to do to change? Well, that person needs to go. That person needs to go. This habit needs to change. And
yeah.
it feels like there's a whole bunch of like domino effects that came out of that, right?
It was huge. It was huge. And
Yeah.
that's why, going back to the COVID thing, like COVID was amazing for me because it actually gave me this little bubble space
Hmm.
to like, figure all this stuff out. And it was this massive domino effect because I basically realized like I'd been so codependent. I'd been in these awful relationships for years and years, and I was like, I'm on my own. Like, I was like, maybe I'm a vegan, I don't even know, let's try being vegan. And I
Right.
did that for a while, and it turns out I'm not a vegan, but I was like able to just like, I literally
Right.
threw everything up in the air that I thought I knew about myself, and I was like, right, let's figure out who I am. That's when I came out about my sexuality. Like, I'd known for a long time that I wasn't straight, and I'd sort of said to people like a few, probably about 7 years before I got clean, I'd said I was bisexual. But I was like, I was married to a man, so I assumed I must be bisexual. Like, and it was only when I was like, I'm on my own finally. I have to be on my own. I'm not using, and I can just, yeah, reassess everything. I was like, I don't think I want to be with men anymore.
Right.
And I went round in circles with it because I'm like, well, am I still actually bisexual, pansexual? And I just happen to have decided that I'm only going to date women, so therefore I tell people I'm a lesbian. Or is it that it's changed, that I did used to like men and now I don't? Or is it that I was always a lesbian and I just, again, I squeezed myself into a box that I didn't fit in, which I think is more likely because I was so, this is the
What's a
masking
form of
thing.
masking, right? Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I was just trying to fit in. And I was, in heteronormative society, most people think that way. And I went to church as a little kid. So that was even like the Uber version of it. Like, you really, might end up in hell. So let's not do that. And it was just like, so it just made sense to go along with that. And it was interesting again, like realizing that whilst I wouldn't say like I hated every moment of being with men, um, I was usually drinking
Right.
and or high. Um, particularly in the like, romantic sexual side of the relationship. So I was like, yeah, that's not really healthy. Um, and now I'm like, I think I still, again, the imposter syndrome kicks in. It's like, oh, can I really call myself a lesbian when I've, had loads of relationships with men in the
Right, right.
past? And it's all of it is just like,
Well, there's a trope,
um,
right, where
yeah,
men can't cuddle unless you're a little bit drunk. So if you're gay, or if you're a little drunk, you're allowed to be gay. So maybe that's what you did, except the other way.
yeah,
You kind of tricked
yeah,
yourself. One interesting thing you just mentioned was how the effect cocaine had on you, in terms of like like in retrospect, you looked around and were like, wait, all these people are having one effect, and it did something different for me. And I think I have had similar conversations with a lot of neurospicy people who are like, hey, my brain is wired differently and substances work differently. There's a bunch of studies out there around autistic folks using MDMA and suddenly feeling like they understand what it would be like to be and this is a quote, functional social creature. So that's one direction, right?
mm,
Psychedelics, like for me personally, psychedelics,
yeah,
if I use them, and I read about how they work on other people, I'm like, no, these experiences are not like either you're a terrible writer or like my experience is
yeah.
extremely different. And so I'm
It's
like, oh,
interesting.
the scary thing about that is what if regular like prescribed pharmaceuticals are similarly have different effects? That would be a terrifying thing to realize and is probably true, to be super honest with you. But yeah, I'm like,
Yeah,
oh, my brain works different, and that takes lots of different shapes.
yeah. Yeah, and it is interesting because I've never even thought about that to sort of ask people with things like psychedelics, which I did as well, whether they experienced it differently. Um, but I think it's very true, and I think it's not just our brains. Like I think drugs and alcohol affect our brains differently, but our physical bodies as well
Right.
are just more sensitive or less sensitive, and I think that's the thing that also can be very confusing for outsiders because
Yeah.
it can fluctuate. So sometimes we can be hypersensitive and sometimes we're hyposensitive. And I certainly, had experiences like that where I was very, very ill physically from the drugs I was doing. And sometimes that would be a lot quicker than other people
Right.
typically. And other times it would be, crazy. Like my tolerance was higher. And so I think it actually fluctuates. But yeah, it is a really interesting question as well about prescribed medication. Because I've just come off of a prescribed medication that I was taking that's an antidepressant, and the withdrawal symptoms have been really extreme. Like I've had extreme insomnia for 6 weeks, and I
Oh
know, like I
goodness.
looked up, like it can be a side effect, insomnia, when you come off of this antidepressant. But I was like, this feels a lot more extreme than, you know, they're saying like a couple of weeks. And so I just
Right.
think, yeah, our bodies definitely seem to function differently. And it's, yeah. Because it is fascinating as well. Why does a stimulant help people with ADHD? I can't, in some ways, get my head around it because I'm like, aren't our brains going too fast? But someone else described it to me recently as it brings your body up to the same speed as your brain. So then you're more in alignment. So it's easier to navigate. And I was like, oh,
Mhm.
okay, maybe that's how it works. I don't know, but
Yeah, I mean the
it
brain
works.
chemistry of why stimulants work on ADHD,
Ah,
it's pretty well researched, and there's some really interesting stuff
yeah.
around there. It's like which receptors work, which receptors don't. And I think that the thing about stimulants, the reason why it works on ADHD is that instead of like constantly multitasking and being pulled in lots of directions, this stimulant puts you in a single track, and so you're able to focus
Mm,
on one thing at a time, and that kind of makes sense, right? Like you're
yeah.
that means that you feel this sense of peace because you're not constantly being pulled in 30 different
Yeah,
directions. Um,
yeah.
like I have had stretches of using alcohol for as a social lubricant, and that has at times been incredibly successful, but most of the time not super awesome. Not super awesome.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I'm not the least impulsive person to begin with. And adding like alcohol to that means that I occasionally do really dumb shit. Whenever I have conversations with autistic folks or neurospicy folks about substances, it becomes very complicated very fast because there's this line people want to surf between um, it being helpful or liking the effects or feeling like there is like, hey, life is better on these
Mm,
substances, and hey, actually this doesn't serve me, maybe not even in the short term, but certainly not in the medium or long term. And
no.
I mean, this is where like psychological dependence becomes really powerful, right? If this is like, I had a conversation recently with for the podcast, and at the end he was like, hey, I actually rather this didn't go out there. I went way deeper than I thought. But he was like I finally felt normal. And so I found myself doing ecstasy 4 nights a week, which, is terrible for your brain chemistry on a number of levels. But he was like, that was the only time I ever felt normal. And so
Mm,
he went through prodigious amount of ecstasy, also known as Molly or MDMA or whatnot.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, he was like, well, I know I'm ruining my brain, but this is the only time I've ever felt normal. And he went
Yeah.
into rehab, got himself clean, and he's living with grief like almost permanently. He's like, I know what it feels like to be normal, and I may never feel that again, and my heart just breaks. You know,
Yeah.
that's got to be terrifying.
And I think for me, I really resonate with that, that
Mm-hmm.
it was how I was feeling normal in a sense, but I also know that I have a new normal now. And a big part of me accepting the new normal has been first a deep acceptance of who I am, and that's in the total. So
Right.
accepting I'm an addict, accepting I'm autistic and ADHD person, accepting I'm a lesbian, accepting I'm a mother, um, all of these things, accepting that I did some really shitty things. I made some really bad decisions in that time.
Right.
Accepting the grief, accepting the trauma of the really, really bad thing that happened to me because of
Mm-hmm.
my vulnerability, because of the people I was associating with. But
And from there,
then,
presumably being able to forgive yourself for the things that happened to you.
yeah, and that's the hard part, but that's really been a big part of it, is forgiveness of myself and forgiveness of other people. And there's some people, I don't know if I've forgiven them yet, but I have set an intention that I want to forgive them because I know that holding on to it is only going to hurt me.
Right.
And I've also, removed myself from those people being in my life, so they're not going to hurt me anymore. But I have the second part of it is I've surrounded myself more and more now with people who accept me how I am.
Mm-hmm.
So I can actually feel normal now in my own skin because I'm surrounding myself with people who don't make me feel inferior or different or awkward. And I still will sometimes feel awkward, even
Right.
around those people. But when I spend more time with people who are also neurodiverse or who are in some way just more accepting, um, then that really helps. Um, and I find that it's like, I don't know how to put this into words properly. Um, but yeah, a lot of the people that I now am very, very close friends with are also addicts in recovery and also neurodiverse. Or they're addicts in recovery, but they've got some other understanding of, neurodiversity. Um, or they're people who are just more spiritual. The other kind of community that I spend time with is a bunch of women who go cold dipping in the lake in the morning and have fire pits and do rituals under the moon. And sometimes with that group, I do feel out of place and I do feel autistic, but there's this real deep love and peace and spirituality in that group
Hmm.
where it's kind of okay. Like I'm accepted, even though I'm a bit weird and quirky sometimes, and even though they might not understand me always.
Right.
But it's like, it goes back to something you said before about finding peace. And it's like now I just seek out the places where I find peace. So
Hmm.
in nature, in that spiritual practice, I find peace. So those are the people I surround myself with. In the, recovery community that I spend time with, I find peace because
Yeah.
there's this acceptance and mutual understanding. And we kind of work on that stuff together, forgiving ourselves.
I
But
think the
yeah,
most
it's
important thing
hard.
you just said in all of that is the word acceptance, right? And I feel like that's a through thread in a lot of
Yeah.
these pieces, right? I mean, in neurospicy communities, in queer communities, in what I'm going to lovingly refer to as your witches, there's acceptance, right? There's like, hey, you do you, I do me. Like, let's not get in each other's way too much. And I accept that you describe it as weird. Sure, you get to be weird. But that level
Yeah.
of, I have a few communities like that where I feel like I'm slowly starting to unmask more and more and more. And I'm kind of daring them to tell me that I'm a weirdo and to stay away. But they're like, no, bring it. And that has been
Yeah.
so healing for me. So powerful.
Yeah. It is, it's really powerful. And I think there is an element of that. It's almost like because where we've been hurt before, uh I do feel like I often go into situations like, bang, this is me, like,
Right.
I dare you to, find me, you know, lacking because I'm waiting for someone to do that. But then actually, I find that a lot of people are way more accepting than I thought. And
Right.
I'm learning to trust myself again. So I think with that deep empathy and deep, like, we sense things very deeply and we can't always connect it necessarily,
Yeah.
the heart and the head and the feelings and all the spirituality. I don't know, it's just like this big soup for me. But what I'm learning is just trust that gut instinct, because
Right.
actually I do feel if someone is safe or not.
Yeah.
And I can't always, and I used to spend a lot of time thinking it through, and then I'd justify people were safe who weren't actually safe.
Right.
And now I need to learn. There's some situations where I have to be around people who, and when I say unsafe, I don't just mean like there's unsafe people like I was in abusive relationships, that kind of unsafe. But I mean, there's also people who are unsafe in my world in the sense of they just don't bring calm and peace. And they're not
Right.
bad people. They're not abusive. They're not doing overt harm, but they're just not people I want to be around a lot because it's not safe to be myself around.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have to be around those people, like in the workplace. And that's what I mean. Like they're not unsafe as in they're dangerous
Right.
menaces to society, but they're just, that for me, going to work is not a safe place. I
But I
can't.
think this is where we have such clunky language around safety, right? Physical safety,
Yeah,
like, ought to be the bare minimum, but there is emotional
yeah,
safety. There is
yeah,
spiritual safety. There is like, if you come out, say, at work as lesbian, like, nobody gets to sneer at you. And if somebody has like a reaction, that person isn't safe, like, inherently, and it doesn't matter why they have a reaction. I think there's
yeah.
another thing that I've been sitting with a lot, because one of the themes in these podcast episodes that keep coming up is physical and sexual abuse and sexual assaults, and how somebody rattled off a stat the other day, which is like 80% of autistic women have been a victim of a sexual assault.
My experience, so I have experienced a sexual assault in a pub. Um, and I was very drunk, and that's a very complicated, situation to unpack in my head because
Yeah.
the guilt around putting myself in a vulnerable position because I was drunk and all of that. But honestly, that was easier to deal with in some ways because I could talk to people. There's a recognized process. I spoke to the police. I mean, nothing came of it, which is very common. It never does, but I followed the rules, the procedure. I told the
Right.
police, I went to counseling. That was kind of, and the SDI clinic helped me and blah, blah, blah. So that kind of incident of a sexual assault in a pub was easier to deal with because it was a bit more clear cut of like
Right.
what happened and the boundaries and what to do. But there's a whole big part of my life looking back where I don't even know if I was sexually abused or taken advantage of, or I just don't even know because I don't know how much of the things I did in those relationships were what I genuinely wanted to do or
Mm,
were coerced because of this trying to fit in and do what I thought you were meant to do as a woman in a relationship with a man. Like, I just don't even know. And then you add in the drugs and alcohol. So then there's a whole, like, the, in my 20s, I was with one man and there was only alcohol involved. And I don't think anything ever happened that I wasn't sort of aware of what was going on and consenting to, I would say. But on the other hand, was the whole thing this big charade of me
right.
being performing how I thought a woman should who's married to a man, right? But then there's this whole period when that relationship ended after 15 years where I was in all kinds of situations and there's times where I don't even know what happened. Like I
Right.
woke up and again I would laugh it off. Um, but it's like when you wake up and you don't really know, you know and sometimes that would be I'd be in bed with someone who was a friend or a safe person in the sense of I trusted them, but I don't have any memory of what we've done. Like
Right.
that doesn't feel good or safe or healthy. um and it's hard to tell how much of it was me trying to perform and fit in and figure out what you're supposed to do as an autistic woman or just as a woman. I think sometimes there's this level of
Right.
us, trying to perform and fit in, and how much of it was influenced by the alcohol and the drugs and the risk-taking behavior
Yeah.
um of wanting to feel something. But I certainly know, like, my experiences have been so different sexually now, being with women and not being under the influence. Um, and there's still, I am someone who likes to do extreme things and take risks, and I'm into like the kink kind of scene and stuff like that. So it's not like it hasn't become suddenly this vanilla experience for me,
Right.
but it's become something just a lot more, I feel a lot more in touch with myself.
It sounds a lot more conscious and certainly a lot more consentful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But that's the weird thing. I think, and I actually don't spend too much time thinking about it. I have a bit, and I've spoken about it in therapy, but I also think I'm not going to spend too much time trying to unpack this because I just don't think I'll ever know fully how much of what happened was consensual or not,
Right.
or that kind of weird borderline. And there's also the times where I don't know if I did things to other people that I crossed the line too. And
Yeah.
that's the scary thing. When I've woken up after parties in the middle of the floor, half naked with other friends, and it's all friends at a party, right? It's not like random people. But when I just have, I'm like, did I cross any boundaries with other people? Did I
Right.
do something unconsensual to them? Like, I don't even know. And that as well is where I recognized that I had a problem. If I can't be using substances, if I'm using substances to the point where I'm blacking out and I don't know what I've done,
Right.
that's not safe for me or other people. because actually in some level I'm going to be harming other people, even if it's just emotionally being offensive, let alone
Totally.
it could, I could have done a lot more damage, and thank goodness I didn't. But
Yeah.
um,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. I'm curious. So, this is going out as a podcast. This will be, and I know, like from the statistics, that not everybody listens to every podcast. So people listen to the things they're interested in. So I imagine people being drawn to this particular episode are people who are curious about substances and substance abuse and drugs and alcohol and whatnot. Do you have like a beginning piece of advice? If somebody has this doubt in their mind, it's like, hey, do I have a problem? Or should I be looking at this? Like, do you have like a question or a prompt, or what would you say to somebody who is curious?
I would say if you're asking the question, do I have a problem? There's probably something to explore there,
Hmm.
because I think, again, go with your gut. Um, but I think people who aren't addicts don't spend much time thinking about whether they are or aren't addicts.
Right.
So I think if that's a
Fair.
question that you're asking, like, am I an addict or have I got a problem with drinking too much? I would go and do some more research and find other people who are recovering, and just look at the symptoms, and really assess whether, as I say, for me, my definition would be obsession and compulsion. So is it something that once you start doing it, you feel like you can't stop in whatever way that looks? Or is it something that you're just constantly thinking about, even when
Hmm.
you're not doing it? Um, and it's not always about how bad the consequences have got. So I've met people in recovery who have had extreme consequences, of
Right.
people they know died, they've lost houses, they've lost jobs, they've lost everything. But it doesn't have to get to that point for it to be a problem,
Right.
And I had still got a job, and I still had my children. My children hadn't been taken away from me, and I still owned a house. But the consequences for me was getting to the point of that spiritual bankruptcy. Like I got to the point where I was suicidal, but I didn't actually. I I had suicidal ideation, but I didn't actually want to kill myself because I didn't want to leave my children behind. So I was in this weird, like, kind of don't want to be here anymore, but I also do because I'm a mum and that matters a lot to me, and I can't leave my children behind. So I was in this weird Groundhog Day of just feeling sort of like spiritually bankrupt and not really sure what to do.
Right.
And the
And that sounds like a
consequences in
real
terms of,
shitty feeling.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was like, and my relationships, with were a disaster and all these kind of things. And I just looked up and I was like, something needs to change here. Um, and yeah, and I think, I started with, I actually had a very good family doctor, GP, because I actually didn't go immediately to the doctor for help with my substance use. I went to the doctor because I couldn't sleep. And the doctor said to me, "Are you taking any other drugs?" And then they asked about drinking. And I was finally honest. It was the
Hmm.
first time a doctor had asked me directly, though. And I thought, in all these years, like this has been going on for several years, no doctor's ever asked. But this doctor did. And I was finally honest and I said, "Yeah, I am. And
So
I'd
what was
like
the
to
question? What
stop."
did they ask that made you go, huh?
They just said, "Are you taking any non-prescribed drugs?"
Got it.
Because
Right.
I was on a very, very heavy sedative for sleep,
Uh-huh.
which I'd been put on after my divorce and after my grandma died, and it wasn't working anymore. And they were like, "Are you taking any other substances?" And I was like, "Well, you know," and it's like, yeah. And I thought I had this like formula all worked out that it'd be okay and I'd still get a few hours sleep. And then that finally stopped working.
Yeah.
But it was that moment. But I really, as I say, I am a very spiritual person, and I really believe that was like the universe's way of bringing everything into alignment for me. Because it was that
Yeah.
moment of realizing I had a choice here. I could be honest and ask for help, or not. And then that sort of led down this path of meeting other people and getting help. And it's, yeah, it was just a relief, actually. It
Yeah.
was a relief to finally go, oh, I've got a problem, but maybe I could get some help.
Right.
And to find other people who were in the same boat, who struggle with addiction,
Yeah.
and to know that I wasn't alone. And again, it's the whole thing of like this whole journey, it all comes back to acceptance because it's like realizing again, I am an addict. I'm not a bad person. I'm not evil. Yes, I've done some things that were not good. Some of my behavior in my active addiction was not good, but that doesn't make me a bad person. It just I'm an addict, and
Right.
that's an illness too. And then once I'd moved through that and started to accept my neurodiversity, again, it was this another layer of relief because it was like, oh, again, like, um, I'm not just broken. And it was interesting because we started a little discussion on one of your posts about meltdowns on
Mm-hmm.
TikTok. And it's really made me think, I've been thinking about that too. And I've been thinking about meltdowns for me were always like usually in the middle of the night crying and screaming, and it was like this really secret shameful thing, and it
Mm.
started I actually probably had quite a few meltdowns younger and as a kid and just didn't know, but I started noticing them
Mm.
when I had my own children. And I remember one particularly bad one where I'd been dealing with a situation with bedwetting that had been going on and on and on. And I remember like having to get up in the middle of the night and change bed sheets again, and then just crying and screaming uncontrollably in this meltdown, and then just feeling like the worst parent ever because I know psychologically, and I wasn't. This was the thing I couldn't even articulate to someone else at the time. I was like, I wasn't angry at my child for wetting the bed. Like it's not their
Right.
fault, and it wasn't directed at them, but obviously the poor, I don't know, I mean, I've probably asked them, they won't remember, they're like 4 or 5 years old, whatever they, but you know, this poor kid's witnessing a parent have this meltdown, but it
Right.
wasn't, I wasn't angry at them for wetting the bed. I was just, I can't keep, I don't know how to deal with this situation. I'm overwhelmed
Yeah.
of having to keep getting up in the middle of the night and change the bed. And so for me, like meltdowns have always been this sort of like thing that I really secretly like had this massive shame around, and I just thought like I just wasn't good enough as a parent. I wasn't good enough as a person. Like everyone else can seem to cope with these
Right.
normal it's a normal part of parenting, or another thing that would tip me into meltdown, it's a normal part of life. And like why can't I cope with normal stuff like normal people? I'm just broken. There's just something fundamentally wrong with me. And
Right.
then realizing that I'm not broken. I'm just
Well,
different. I'm
and
just
in that
wired
process,
differently.
I hear you dehumanizing yourself. Right? It's not just
Yeah.
that you're saying I'm a bad person. You're like doubting if you even are a person in that, right? And that is like
Wow.
that is such a
Mm,
grim place to be because dehumanization is like step one towards all sorts of nastiness in the world. But when you aim that at yourself, you don't have a shield. Like you can't prevent yourself from listening to yourself. And I think a lot of addiction comes from that. Like if that is your own inner monologue, yeah, you would drink to make that go away. Right?
yeah. Yeah. And it's so profound what you're saying though, because I think that's so true that there's and that's a constant juggling act that I'm in at the moment, actually, of do I actually need to have a nap or sleep, or do I
Mm-hmm.
need to go do something that is bringing me peace? And that might be getting up at 6:15 to go walk into a freezing cold lake. And
Right.
that's what I do. I walk into Lake Ontario with a bunch of other women, and we just stand there for a few minutes and do the cold dip thing. And it grounds me and resets me. And there's this element of women gathering that's, you know, just somehow profoundly spiritual too. We don't even have to do anything particular. We're just having a chat, but we're there gathering. and it's like being in nature, or I've like go to a sound bath this weekend with a lady who does like sound
Nice.
baths and she has these tuning fork things, and I find that deeply spiritual. Every time she puts it like on my third eye, I'm like having out of body experiences and talking to my dead grandma and things like that. But it's just, but going and doing those kind of spiritual practices, um, really, really helps me. And I've been on this really interesting journey because I was deeply spiritual as a kid growing up in church, but there was bits of it that didn't work, and I couldn't get my head around. I didn't like, and the hypocrisy, and then
Yeah.
I left that as a teenager, and then I've come back to this sort of spirituality, and I suddenly realized I was like, I think I still, some of the stuff I believed in as a kid is still there. And
Hmm.
I don't really care if you call it God or the universe or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't matter to me now.
Yeah.
But for a while, I was like, I don't really want to talk to Christians because I was so sort of like triggered by what I went through as a kid. And then I sort of now I was like, oh, I can listen to people talk about Christianity and God and Jesus, and I'm less triggered because I hear behind it the spirituality now.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, that's just your way of finding peace, like you said. And my way is different now.
Totally. And that
My way
evolves with
is,
everybody, I think.
yeah,
Incidentally,
but
have you ever
it's
Googled autism and tuning forks?
no. Is there a thing
There
about
is a
it?
thing. Um, I
No.
was listening to the Telepathy tapes, which is an amazing podcast. Highly recommend it. Where they're following over like 9 episodes. They're following a bunch of autistic kids around who have like they're mostly non-speaking, but they have a bunch of other connections. And in one episode,
Yeah.
they kind of have this throwaway line where this kid is able to learn once a teacher hits a tuning fork. And I was like, that it rang a bell, pun not intended, but it rang
Mm.
a bell in me. And I Googled it. And there's a whole bunch of studies and research and anecdotes about people who are able to tune into parts of themselves if particular music, particular frequencies are playing. So when you mentioned a tuning fork and you talking to your dead grandma,
Yeah.
there is something there that is not entirely uncommon with autistic folks, and it blew
Wow.
my mind. It is
That's really
absolutely
interesting.
bonkers. Hey, I also want to be. I would love to talk to you for another 4 hours, but I try to keep these to under an hour, and
I
we've been
know.
going for a lot longer than that.
It's
Um,
crazy. I didn't even realize. I was like,
yeah, we've been talking to for about an
yeah.
hour 15. So I suspect
Wow.
I need to have you come back on the podcast for another episode. But I'd like to wrap this one
Yeah.
up because
Yeah.
otherwise I will just we'll end up with 9 hour
Yeah. We'll be
episodes.
here all night. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and I would love that, but I'm sure our listeners at some point
Oh,
be like, "This is not an audiobook. This is a
yes.
podcast."
Yes. Exactly.
um, so I have two questions that I love to close on, and the first one is, what do you wish neurotypical folks knew about autistic people?
So this one I did actually think about before the podcast, because I was like, when I first saw that in your list of questions, I was like, there's so many things. What do I choose? Um, but I've landed on the thing that's most relevant at the moment and coming up the most in my life, and that's, I wish that people who are autistic understood that when I, as an autistic person, am asking questions, I'm seeking to clarify and understand a situation, and I genuinely am coming at it from a place of curiosity and understanding. And I find so often in particularly work, but sometimes outside of work too, the amount of questions I ask, people get defensive and they
Mm-hmm.
think that I'm trying to undermine their authority, or they think that I'm trying to suggest what they're doing is wrong, or they think there's all these kind of other like assumptions, and I just think as autistic people, we're so straightforward. Like we're just asking what we're asking,
Yeah.
and that's it. But also, particularly in work, I sometimes need to understand why I'm doing something. So I need to ask a bunch of questions, and I don't get the answers
Mm-hmm.
because it's like, well, you're just being difficult. You're just trying to question our authority. And I'm like, no, no, like this is the point. If you could understand, I need to understand why we're doing this task. And even if I think the reason we're doing this task is fucking ridiculous, if I understand why, I'll do it. And
Right.
that's it. That's all you need to get me on board. I need to understand why. And I might still be like, don't agree with the why, but I'll do it. Whereas if I'm just doing something, I don't know why, I will dig my heels in and I'll be like, I don't want to do
Right.
this. Doesn't make any
Well, and
sense.
there's zero way of motivating for that kind of thing. I
Yeah.
I get that
Yeah, so
totally.
I
Yeah.
really wish more people could understand that autistic people ask questions a lot of the time to clarify. Sometimes it's
Hmm.
about making ourselves feel safer as well. It's part of that kind of like calming and safety system for me. And it doesn't have an ulterior hidden agenda. Like if I'm trying to question your authority, I'll just tell you.
Right.
That's the thing. I won't be subtle and ask a bunch of questions. I'll just say, I don't agree with this. So,
Right.
yeah. So that's what I
I
wish more
love
people
that.
understood.
Thank you for sharing.
Ah.
Um, and my parting grace is would you tell me of a time that you felt truly seen and loved in exactly the right way for you?
Again, this one is really hard to answer because on the one hand, it actually brings up for me a lot of times when I haven't, and that's
Yeah.
really painful.
Yeah.
Um, but I think just a little one that happened recently was I was having a Christmas gathering, and in the group chat it was like, let's do a what's it called? Not Secret Santa, but the one where you get presents and
Like
then
a white
you unwrap
elephant.
them and yeah, something like that. So, and then everyone can steal the presents and
Yeah.
stuff. And someone had put this in the group chat, and this is what we were going to do. And I sent a message to the group saying, I just don't have the capacity. I love the idea, but I don't have the capacity, so I'll opt out. Um, and two of the people in the group like messaged me privately because they were wanting me to be able to participate,
Right.
and they didn't fully understand why at first because they were sort of making suggestions of like, oh, it doesn't have to be something expensive, or you could make something, or, and I was like, no, the problem isn't that I don't have the money. I have the money. And it's not even necessarily the time. It's like I don't have the emotional capacity to figure out what to get and then buy it and wrap it up and all those things because I'm just too much struggling at the moment and it's Christmas and everything. And this
Yeah.
is the start of me having more boundaries and saying no if I can't do things. And then they were like, both of them offered to, well, I'm going to get some extra things anyway, so I'll just bring something so you can just be included. And I was like, that's wonderful. Like that really makes me feel seen in the sense of like they even bothered to message me to,
Right.
say, hey, we want to make sure you can be involved, but that they didn't, as I said, I don't know if they fully understood even when I explained the why, but it didn't
Right.
matter. They were like, well, we'll get an extra present and you can be in it. And I was like, that's really inclusive when people are like, okay, it doesn't even matter. We'll just make sure you're included. Um,
That is so
so yeah,
beautiful.
yeah,
Yeah. And for somebody listening to this who doesn't understand that, I think it's just it's the autism tax. It's like even just the idea of figuring out what to get, then making it happen, then making it arrive, then making sure you have all the bits and pieces at the right time to wrap
yeah.
it, and then remembering to bring it with you to the thing. Like the number of presents I have just left, like I did all the things and then forgot the very last step,
Mm.
which was bring the damn thing with me. And it's just like, look, I have money, I have time, I have all of these things, but I cannot.
Yeah, yeah. And so but often, I mean, in the past, I wouldn't have said no. This is me getting better at having boundaries and knowing my limits and saying
Right,
no. So there's part of the story is me being honest and saying what my capacity is. But then also in the past, if I have said no to things, people have made me feel, and not overtly, but a little bit like, oh, well, why can't you,
Right. Well, can't you just? Yeah,
um,
totally.
yeah,
Well, and I want to point out something to you here, which is you held a boundary, and that resulted in a story that you're telling on a podcast, right? A lot of the time, choosing to not conform or choosing to do something differently is the beginning of like this beautiful side quest. And I
yeah.
think, like, if I had known that earlier, I think I would have been braver with that.
Yeah, I think I wish I'd known and understood about boundaries a lot younger. And it's something, we don't get taught in school, right? And
Right.
you know, and
They
it
do
makes a
now,
massive
finally,
difference.
which
Well,
is,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
about
yeah,
time.
and that is and that is something, the conversations I have with my teenagers are very different now,
Yeah.
and when they were younger. But yeah,
What a
yeah,
blessing.
it is. So yeah.
Thank you so much for taking your time and energy and executive functioning to join me.
I've really enjoyed it. You put me right at ease, and then we just sort of meandered through all kinds of subjects, and it's been really interesting. And I'm gonna go Google tuning forks and autistic people now. So
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the podcast. You can find us on TikTok at Autistic FM, on Instagram at autistic_FM, and on the web at autistic.fm. On the website, you can subscribe for free to join in the discussions for each episode and to suggest future guests that you'd love to hear from. You can also become a supporter for as little as $5 a month, and by doing so, you can suggest topics for the podcast and submit questions for our guests, adding your voice to the conversation. This podcast is produced and hosted by me, Haya Camps. It's been such a pleasure sharing Catherine's inspiring journey with you today, and her story really reminded me of the importance of acceptance, self-discovery, and surrounding yourself with supportive communities.